Hey, what's going on, guys? 118 Seth Shadow here. So, for today, we're going over a new deck profile for Shadowverse Evolve. Normally, I find myself to be more of a Forest and Havencraft player, but the other day I decided to switch up a little bit and try my hand at the more recent Fable build for Abysscraft, which I call the Immortal Necro hand. This deck is a combination of control, which involves ripping up your opponent's hand, building up Necrocharge, and finishing your opponent off with a bunch of big followers, while also continuing to control them. This deck is filled with a variety of different abilities, between discarding abilities like Nice Nature and Crazed Executioner, to Pearl and Fine Motion, which will assist you with your Necrocharge plays, which will eventually get you to the point to play bigger followers that all utilize your Necrocharge to be able to use different types of skills and also just make your overall plays a lot more efficient. So without further ado, let's take a look at the deck list first. It's a 40 card deck, 10 cards for the Evo. Let's take a look at what we've got in here. The way it's spread, the curve is a lot more focused around followers from mid-range to 3-4 points. Then you have a lot of followers that end up moving into 5 and 7 points overall. You do have a fair number of followers in the 2-point range too, but a lot of them, there are specific ones that you really want to have, and we'll go into those details later when we get into how you play this deck. The deck build, though, is 2 Bellringer Angel, 3 Soul Conversion, 2 Punk Devils, 1 Hell's Unleasher, 2 Lilith, 2 Seeking the Pearl, a Spectre, Undying Resentment, Crazed Executioner, both of those are at 3s, sorry. Fine Motion at 2, 2 Marazenski, 3 Nice Nature, 3 Cerberus, 1 Ottle Black Swan, 2 Rice Shower, 3 Dark Alice, 2 Death's Breath, and 3 Azazel. And when we get to the Evo deck, it's 1 Bellringer, 1 Lilith, 2 Crazed Executioner, 1 Marazenski, 2 Cerberus, 1 Azazel, and 2 Carrots. So the deck has a lot of Uma Musume followers in it, hence the Carrots. You'll have a lot of options for racing when it comes to Fine Motion, for playing its ability, or you might use it just so Seeking the Pearl or Rice Shower will be able to rush in for some damage at some point. Same with Nice Nature. For draw power, that's a combination of Bellringer and Soul Conversion. Lilith and Punk Devil serve as healing. Death's Breath and Hell's Unleasher fetch cards from your drop to play onto the board or your hand. When it comes to control, you have Undying Resentment and Spectre for using Bane and just for outright destroying followers with damage. Ottle Black Swan plays the same way. And I would say the main unit of the deck is Dark Alice, for the fact that it stays on the board the longest, and Azazel is in there for the extra oomph, as well as the potential to OTK your opponent with this deck. So that's the overview of the deck list. Let's go ahead and take a look at how the deck plays. The way this deck works out is you're trying to keep your opponent under control, not necessarily from their board. You're trying to keep their board under control, but you're trying to force them to lose cards, and you're also trying to build up your drop as quickly as possible for Necrocharge 10. Once you've done that, you have access to a lot of items during the mid of the game, which enable you for a quick win through some pretty powerful followers. But we're going to talk about this in sequence of the start of the game to the mid, and then just talk about other options from there on. When you're in the early game, you're not going to have that many 2-point drops in this deck. Effectively, your 2 big ones are going to be these: Undying Resentment and Seeking the Pearl. Your 2 drops are basically all about building up your drop for Necrocharge while also providing some kind of a benefit. Seeking the Pearl is a 3/2, so it's powerful for a 2 cost, and Undying Resentment is control, where it'll deal 3 damage to an opponent. From there, you also have a lot of 3-point followers in this deck, so if you go second, you do have a lot of extra benefit of the Evo points, particularly if you go into Fine Motion or Crazed Executioner. Nice Nature is nice, but is not something that you would really want to use your Evo point for feeding that much. You can as necessary, but normally you don't want to find yourself in that situation. But let's talk about Necrocharge for a second. If you consider Seeking the Pearl and you consider Undying Resentment, Seeking the Pearl mills you 2 cards, while Undying Resentment mills you 1. But remember, these 2 cards will also go into your graveyard at the same time in these cases, so you could actually count Seeking the Pearl as 3 cards, while Undying Resentment is 2. And when it comes to Fine Motion also mills you 2, but once it drops as well, it's 3. So you could technically count it as 3. If you manage to get these 3 and have them all go off in your early game, that's 3, 6, 8. And on top of that, if you get Nice Nature in that mix, you have 9 already. I don't know what I'm doing with my fingers here. In any case, this would be your optimal setup, where by turn 4, you already have the setup to get at least 9 into the drop for Necrocharge, and then you only need 1 more after that. Because the way it would end up going is that Seeking the Pearl is your play 2, Nice Nature is your play 3. Once you get to turn 4, you'll go to Fine Motion, and then Undying Resent. That is the other problem, though. To be able to do it within 4 turns is a little constricting, so usually it'll take you 5 turns to be able to pull this off. Meaning that if you do want to get to Necrocharge 10, it is still a little bit difficult, unless you have some 1-point options that you go to use for it as well, which you could play Bellringer for the early 1-point play, and if it falls as well, then you'll have your 10 right there. Crazed Executioner is a card I want to talk about too. Given that this is Necrohand, hand control, this is an amazing card to use. It doesn't have any effect for its base form, but once you Evo it, it allows you to look at your opponent's hand and then force them to discard a card of your choice. It does cost you 2 life, but being able to look at what your opponent can do and forcing them to play suboptimally is something that you have to consider as well when it comes to this card. So you're basically losing 2 life in order to see just what your opponent can do to you. That's why this card is great overall. If you can play it at the 3 or 4 drop point, that's amazing. Because then it's early enough to the point where you can really mess up your opponent's plays and screw them up for the mid game. Soul Conversion is in here for combo plays as well as extra draw power. When you consider how you can play this card, the best comboing is with cards like Nice Nature, where if your opponent performs an action in which you can respond while Nice Nature's on the board, you could force them to discard a card out of the blue by just having Nice Nature fall to Soul Conversion. You get to draw 2, you'll lose Nice Nature, but you also force your opponent to lose a card. Also, if your opponent is attacking into Bellringer, and you have Soul Conversion at the ready, you can destroy the Bellringer on your own and immediately just draw 3 cards right there. So, this card has good utility, and it's just generic draw power, which is something that you want to have in this deck regardless. In terms of some other options I had for tech, I also played a copy of Spectre, which I'm starting to think I'm just going to replace this with Spar Toy Soldier. Every time I use Spectre, I used it for the mill. I never got to take advantage of the Rush or Bane aspect of this card at all, and I really want to focus on being able to hit Necrocharge as quickly as possible, so Spar Toy Soldier is looking like a better option than this compared to what I have here. That's it for when it comes to early game. Some tech options I do want to go over before I start going into the mid game include cards like Rice Shower and Hell's Unleasher. Rice Shower is in here because there are a lot of Uma followers in here. Not to mention this is a ward and also helps fuel your Necrocharge because this will mill you 2 cards as well. Not to mention once you hit its last words, you can pick up an Uma follower from your drop. So it gives you more cards back once this thing falls. Ultimately a great card because between you have Seeking the Pearl, you have Bind Motion, you have Nice Nature, and you're also going to have Marozensky, which I guess I can go over it right now, as once you get to the mid game, this card shines a lot. It's Necrocharge 10, -4/-4 to one of your opponent's followers, and if you look at the Evo version of it, on Evo you -2/-2 to a follower. So it's extra board control, but the full effect of the board control comes once you hit Necrocharge 10. If you have to use it early, don't hesitate, because it's more important to make sure you've got your opponent's board under control than it is to try and capitalize off this skill, because you're not hitting Necrocharge until at least turn 5 no matter what. Then you've also got Hell's Unleasher, which is in here to be able to fish cards back out of your drop. Given that you're milling so much, if you mill a piece that you want and you drew into Hell's Unleasher, you can just get rid of this card and get back a piece that you're looking for instead of having to, and it won't be lost forever, basically. Now let's talk about the mid game and most of your big units that you're going to be wanting to go into. The big cards of this deck are the 4 that you see below, and the biggest one I'd say of the whole lot is Dark Alice. Dark Alice is not really the key of the deck, but it certainly can be so. This card is a 6/6 with Rush that forces your opponent to discard on attack. And in addition, if this card is destroyed, you can banish the top 10 cards of your deck to revive it, and then you discard a card as well. So, it's immortal. No matter how many times your opponent destroys it, it can just keep on coming back as long as you've got cards in your deck to bring it back. Also, if you don't have any cards in your hand, you can still revive this card, because the cost is to banish the top 10 cards, then you revive it by putting it onto the field, and then you discard a card. So, if you can't discard a card, that's fine, because that's not part of the cost. All you have to do is banish 10 cards, but remember, if you don't have at least 10 cards in your deck, then you can't revive it. So keep that in mind as well. Other cards are Cerberus, which is used for a combination of board control as well as power buffs, which will go into the potential OTK that this deck can do, and I'll talk about that in a second. But Cerberus is a good follower to have in this deck for those aspects. And its Evo is what will give you additional board control and power through Mimi and Coco. And if you manage to get to Necrocharge 10, you get even more of them than you were going to get before. Adel is the next one to consider, where this card is quite versatile, but you're almost never going to end up getting to its Necrocharge, given that you're usually ending games a lot earlier than that. It deals 2 damage to all opposing followers as well as the opponent's leader, and then the strike that it has does the same thing. So if you manage to keep this on the board for a turn, that's 4 damage to your opponent's leader right there, as well as being able to board control quite significantly. And finally, we have Azazel. This card, when played, allows you to force your opponent to discard a card randomly, and if you hit Necrocharge 10, it will cost 4 instead of 7, which is really nice. Now, I was talking about an OTK that you can perform with this deck. Why don't we go over that right now? The OTK is comprised of these 3 cards right here, but it does require you to be Necrocharge 10, and you need to Evo the Cerberus as well. The way it works is, you play Cerberus, get 2 Cocos through its own skill and then evolving it. You get Dark Alice onto the board, and then if your opponent destroys it, definitely make sure you revive it. Then you play Azazel, and then you Evo Azazel. Azazel's Evo has an ability, it changes your opponent's life to 10. By doing that, Alice is a 6/6, and with Cerberus, if you have 2 Cocos, you put both the Cocos on Alice, buffing its attack points to 10, and then you just swing for 10 damage and finish your opponent off right there. That's the OTK. However, it's not consistent, and I have never been able to pull it off in my games yet, so I would not rely on it. I would just rely on consistently dealing damage to your opponent while whittling their hand and trying to get in the damage with Dark Alice or your other big followers. That's the overall goal of how the deck wins, but the OTK is possible, it's just not consistent from the way I see it. As for living, you do have to consider what I said before about there not being too many 2-drops in this deck. These are your only other potential 2-drops, Lilith and Punk Devil. Both of these cards have healing that can provide you with extra livability in the deck. Lilith needs to be evolved for that to work, and it needs to swing, so it is a little bit more restrictive, while Punk Devil has to be destroyed, and then it will give you 2 life back. The thing about this deck is because you don't have very many other 2-point plays, you might get early game rushed by your opponent, and you will have to take some damage no matter what. In all the games I've played with this deck so far, I've never had a game where I didn't lose more than 10 life. And there was one game where it was necessary for me to have played one of these in order to stay alive, because I lost too much life to the point where I was literally down to about 2. And the only reason I was because I was able to play these. Every game that I've played so far has mostly been going first, so I can't tell you too much about the going second prospects, outside of the fact that it makes your 3-drops for Necrocharge far stronger because you can Evo right away for them. When it comes to Fine Motion, Nice Nature if you want to feed it, and then of course you've got Crazed Executioner to forcibly discard your opponent's hand earlier than anticipated. But that is how the deck works. Ultimately, just to recap, it's build up your drop as much as possible with your lower cost followers, force your opponent to discard cards from their hand with the use of Crazed Executioner and Nice Nature, and once you get to your mid game, you will further force your opponent to discard cards while also dealing them some heavy damage. And you can also continue with your board control, as well as some extra ping damage and power buffs that will end up having you win the game at the end. That's the way the deck works in a nutshell, and it is a fun deck. Every single time I've played it, every game I've had was a nail biter, and it's, like I said, pretty exciting to play. And I hope you guys enjoyed. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys later.